What if I told you that while Jimmy Page was crafting some of rock's most legendary riffs?
While Jimmy Page was building his reputation as one of rock's greatest guitarists and leading Led Zeppelin to massive success, several fellow musicians were reportedly watching from the sidelines with growing resentment. These weren't just any musicians. They were some of the most talented guitarists of their generation who felt that Page's commercial success overshadowed their own artistic contributions. The story of these rivalries reveals a darker side of rock history, where exceptional talent sometimes bred bitter jealousy. From blues legends who felt their techniques were being commercialized by a younger player, to progressive rock pioneers who saw their complex compositions overshadowed by Page's stadium-filling anthems, the music world was full of grudges and backstage confrontations. These weren't simple professional disagreements. According to various industry insiders, roadies, and former band members, some of these rivalries sparked legal battles that lasted for decades, while others festered in silence until they erupted in explosive public outbursts. The tensions were fueled by everything from stolen riff accusations to publishing disputes, and from angry interviews to career-long resentments about who received credit for musical innovations. Jeff Beck. The virtuoso's frustration. Jeff Beck was widely regarded as one of the most technically gifted guitarists of his era. His innovative playing techniques and experimental approach to the instrument should have made him a household name. However, while Beck was pushing the boundaries of what a guitar could do, his former Yardbirds bandmate Jimmy Page was becoming rock royalty with what Beck apparently considered simpler but more commercially appealing music. The roots of Beck's alleged resentment can be traced back to their shared time in the Yardbirds. Despite joining the band after Beck, Page seemed to racked more attention and media coverage. Former Yardbirds drummer Jim McCarty later claimed that Beck would make cutting remarks about Page's theatrical stage presence, suggesting it was overshadowing genuine musical talent. What particularly bothered Beck was the stark difference in their commercial success. While Beck was exploring jazz fusion and experimental sounds that challenged listeners, Page was filling massive stadiums with riffs that were effective, but in Beck's apparent view, relatively straightforward. Music critics of the time noted that Beck would sometimes complain in interviews about audiences preferring spectacular performances over genuine musical innovation. The jealousy became more public through Beck's subtle criticisms in interviews, where he would take indirect shots at guitarists who seemed to prioritize showmanship over musical substance. According to former Beck roadie Martin Stone, Beck kept detailed records of Led Zeppelin's album sales and would obsessively compare them to his own more modest commercial performance. Perhaps most telling was Beck's reaction whenever he encountered Page's image in guitar magazines. Multiple photographers reported seeing Beck quickly flip past magazine covers featuring Page, often with visible disgust. Session musician Nicky Hopkins allegedly overheard Beck expressing frustration that genuine guitarists were being overlooked, while rock stars collected praise for what he considered basic chord progressions that any skilled player could perform without difficulty. Ritchie Blackmore. Classical meets commercial. Frustration. Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple had spent years developing a sophisticated approach to hard rock that incorporated classical music elements. His pioneering techniques influenced countless guitarists who came after him. However, when Jimmy Page emerged with his mystical imagery and folk influences somehow becoming recognized as the definitive rock guitarist, Blackmore's more classically sophisticated approach seemed to remain underappreciated by mainstream audiences. Industry insiders claimed that this recognition gap deeply frustrated the Deep Purple guitarist. The tension reportedly began when Led Zeppelin started outselling Deep Purple, despite what Blackmore apparently viewed as his superior formal musical training. Former Purple keyboardist John Lord later claimed that Blackmore would go into long rants about Page's lack of formal musical education while somehow achieving greater commercial success through what Blackmore saw as pure marketing savvy. What particularly bothered Blackmore was the different reception their equally complex musical arrangements received from critics. While his classically influenced compositions were sometimes dismissed as pretentious or overly complicated, Page's similarly intricate arrangements were praised as groundbreaking and revolutionary. This double standard seemed to eat away at Blackmore's sense of fairness in the music industry. Music journalist Jeff Barton remembered attending a 1973 press conference where Blackmore made pointed comments about guitarists who relied on sheer volume rather than musical virtuosity to impress audiences. The rivalry intensified as both bands competed for the same rock audiences, with Blackmore apparently becoming increasingly frustrated by Led Zeppelin's ability to generate more media attention. Former Rainbow manager Bruce Payne alleged that Blackmore became obsessed with matching Led Zeppelin's elaborate stage productions. He reportedly spent considerable amounts of money on medieval-themed stage setups that never seemed to generate the same level of media coverage or audience excitement that Page's performances achieved naturally. The situation became more personal when guitar magazines consistently featured Page on their covers, while giving Blackmore less prominent coverage. Former Deep Purple producer Martin Birch allegedly overheard Blackmore express his belief that serious musicians were losing ground to performers who understood image and marketing better than actual musical theory and sophisticated compositional techniques. Eric Clapton. The Bluesmaster's Betrayal. Eric Clapton had earned the nickname God from his devoted followers, who respected his authentic interpretation of blues music and his emotionally powerful guitar playing. Clapton had spent years carefully studying traditional blues forms and paying homage to the original masters of the genre. However, when Jimmy Page began incorporating those same blues techniques, mixing them with heavy rock elements, and somehow achieving even greater fame than Clapton himself, it reportedly left the bluesmaster feeling genuinely betrayed. According to sources close to both musicians, Clapton felt that Page was commercializing sacred musical traditions without showing proper respect to the original African-American artists who had created the blues. Former Cream drummer Ginger Baker claimed that Clapton was particularly upset about what he saw as Page's casual appropriation of techniques that Clapton had spent years studying with reverence and careful attention to their cultural significance. What really hurt Clapton was how quickly Page seemed to achieve credibility in the blues world. Clapton had worked for years building his reputation through careful study of blues masters like Robert Johnson and B.B. King, slowly earning respect from both critics and fellow musicians. Page, on the other hand, seemed to achieve instant credibility by simply being louder, more theatrical, and more commercially successful. Music executive Robert Stigwood remembered Clapton complaining that authentic musical substance was being sacrificed in favor of pure showmanship. During the early 1970s, when critics and fans debated who were the greatest guitar heroes of the era, Clapton's name appeared less frequently in these discussions, despite his obvious technical superiority and deeper understanding of blues traditions. Former Derek and the Dominoes bassist Carl Rattle allegedly overheard Clapton expressing frustration that genuine blues playing was being overshadowed by what he considered circus-like performances. The situation became even more personal when Stairway to Heaven became rock music's ultimate anthem, despite what Clapton apparently viewed as relatively basic blues progressions. Multiple industry figures reported that Clapton was genuinely puzzled and frustrated that audiences seemed to prefer Page's theatrical approach over his own more authentic emotional expression. Former manager Robert Stigwood claimed that Clapton spent months trying to analyze and understand why Page's showmanship resonated more strongly with audiences than Clapton's deeper connection to the blues tradition. Tony Iommi, the heavy metal pioneer's recognition problem. Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath had literally invented heavy metal guitar playing after losing his fingertips in a factory accident. This physical limitation forced him to develop entirely new techniques that became the foundation of an entire musical genre. However, while Iommi was creating something completely revolutionary, Jimmy Page was receiving credit for pioneering heavy rock music, despite building on musical foundations that already existed. Industry veterans claimed that this misattribution of credit drove the Black Sabbath guitarist to distraction. The frustration reportedly began when music critics started crediting Led Zeppelin with inventing heavy music while largely ignoring Black Sabbath's earlier and more extreme contributions to the genre. Former Sabbath bassist Geezer Butler claimed that Iommi would collect articles praising Page's heavy sound while dismissing Black Sabbath as merely a novelty act or a passing fad. What particularly annoyed Iommi was the recognition he received for his technical innovations, despite Revo's revolutionizing guitar playing through overcoming severe physical adversity. Page seemed to receive more critical praise for relatively standard techniques that were simply presented with better production values and more sophisticated marketing. Music journalist Lester Bangs remembered interviewing Iommi in 1971, during which the guitarist made bitter comments about players who achieved fame through superior marketing rather than genuine musical innovation. The rivalry intensified as both bands competed to create the heaviest, most powerful sound in rock music. Former Sabbath manager Patrick Meehan alleged that Iommi became obsessed with proving that his guitar work was more genuinely groundbreaking than Page's. This obsession led him to constantly push for even heavier recordings, which record labels often resisted because they were concerned about commercial viability. Perhaps most telling was Iommi's reaction to the widespread praise Page received for his guitar tone and sound. Multiple sources reported that he genuinely resented seeing Page celebrated for sounds that Iommi had pioneered years earlier with far less recognition or credit. Former Sabbath producer Roger Bain allegedly overheard Iommi expressing his belief that real innovators were being forgotten, while musicians who had merely copied and popularized existing techniques received all the accolades and historical credit. Keith Richards, the Riff Master's Territory Invasion. Keith Richards had built his entire reputation on creating some of the most memorable and instantly recognizable guitar riffs in rock history. These riffs formed the backbone of countless Rolling Stones classics and established Richards as the undisputed master of the rock riff. However, when Jimmy Page started receiving critical praise for his own riff-writing abilities, it seemed to encroach on what Richards considered his specialized territory, and he reportedly watched his own contributions become overshadowed. According to band insiders, this invasion of his musical specialty absolutely infuriated Richards. The jealousy allegedly began when music critics started directly comparing Page's riffs to Richards' legendary creations, often seeming to favor the Led Zeppelin guitarist's more complex and layered arrangements over Richards's more straightforward but equally effective approach. Former Stones producer Jimmy Miller claimed that Richards would obsessively study Page's compositions, carefully analyzing them to find weaknesses while grudgingly acknowledging their undeniable effectiveness. This obsessive analysis seemed to consume considerable amounts of Richards' creative energy. What really bothered Richards was the different way critics treated their similar work. While his riffs were often dismissed as simple but catchy, Page's equally straightforward progressions were analyzed and praised as sophisticated compositions worthy of serious musical study. Music journalist Nick Kent remembered being present at a 1974 Rolling Stones recording session, where Richards made sarcastic comments about guitarists who received what he considered undeserved intellectual credit for their work. The rivalry became more personal when both guitarists found themselves competing for the same session musicians and producers. Former Stones manager Alan Klein alleged that Richards deliberately avoided working with anyone who had professional associations with Led Zeppelin, apparently fearing that his musical ideas might be shared with his competition. Perhaps most damaging to Richards's ego was his reaction to Page's success in earning songwriting royalties. Multiple sources reported that he was genuinely angry about Page's publishing income, feeling that his own equally valuable musical contributions were generating significantly less money. Former Stones assistant Joe Bergman allegedly overheard Richards expressing his belief that genuine riff masters were being financially overshadowed by what he considered pretenders, who simply understood the business side of music better than the creative side. Jimi Hendrix, the ultimate innovator's paranoid obsession. Jimi Hendrix had revolutionized electric guitar playing more completely than perhaps any other musician in history. He created sounds that nobody had thought possible and established himself as the instrument's ultimate innovator and creative genius. However, according to those closest to him, Hendrix became increasingly obsessed with Jimmy Page's rising fame and Led Zeppelin's commercial success, watching their achievements with growing paranoia and resentment that may have contributed to his tragic personal decline. Former experienced bassist Noel Redding claimed that Hendrix collected every Led Zeppelin album and would play them repeatedly, carefully analyzing Page's techniques while muttering about inferior players receiving superior recognition and commercial success. This obsessive behavior apparently became more pronounced as Hendrix's own career began facing various challenges. The jealousy reportedly intensified when music critics began directly comparing the two guitarists, often suggesting that Page's more structured and disciplined approach to psychedelic rock was aging better than Hendrix's more experimental and chaotic style. These comparisons seemed to deeply disturb Hendrix's sense of his own artistic worth and legacy. What particularly troubled Hendrix was the commercial trajectory of their respective careers. While his own album sales were declining, and his live performances were becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable, Led Zeppelin was achieving massive worldwide success with what appeared to be a more disciplined and businesslike approach to creating and marketing psychedelic rock music. Music executive Alan Douglas remembered being present at a 1970 recording session where Hendrix expressed his belief that audiences were abandoning true musical innovation in favor of safer, more commercially palatable alternatives. The obsession became genuinely destructive when Hendrix started incorporating Page-influenced techniques into his own playing, apparently abandoning his unique revolutionary style in favor of more conventional approaches that he thought might recapture commercial success. Former drummer Mitch Mitchell allegedly told friends that Hendrix seemed to be losing his own musical identity while desperately chasing someone else's commercial formula for success. This loss of artistic direction may have contributed to the personal problems that ultimately led to Hendrix's tragic death at the young age of 27. These 6 legendary guitarists, each exceptional in their own right, reportedly found themselves consumed by jealousy over Jimmy Page's incredible success with Led Zeppelin. From established blues masters to metal pioneers, even the greatest players of their generation apparently struggled to handle Page's commercial and critical dominance of the rock guitar world during the 1970s and beyond.